Okay, I can see people joining. Hello, welcome to the January webinar of the BIPS series for 2026. And we're really delighted to have Julia Hartley here to speak with us about some really fascinating research. So I'll just tell you a tiny bit about Julia. Julia is a lecturer in comparative literature at the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at Glasgow. And before that, she was at KCL, King's College London, as a lecturer in comparative literature. And before that, she was a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Warwick. And she did her BA and Master's and Doctorate, all of her studies at the University of Oxford in French and Italian literature. And she impressively has a second Master's, as if one wasn't enough, in Iranian studies that she completed at SOAS. And she'll be talking to us today about Jane Dieulafoy's Persia, Gender, Empire, and Archaeology in fin-de-siècle France. And we're really, really looking forward to hearing all about that. And I can see we've got some more people who have joined now. And with that, we are ready to hear from Julia about Jane Dieulafoy. Over to you. I'll just remove myself. Thank you very much, Julia.
I'll just share my slides. All right. On 20 October 1886, in the Louvre Museum in Paris, Jane Dieulafoy was awarded the Legion of Honor for their contribution to the archaeological mission led by their husband, Marcel Dieulafoy, at SOAS. The award sealed Jane Dieulafoy's celebrity status as France's first female archaeologist and the third female Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur. The decoration took place in front of a temporary display of the finds in the museum's basement. The restoration and curatorial work to complete the Salle Dieulafoy rooms would take 2 years. The Louvre had originally intended to devote one room to the SOAS collection, but the archaeological finds far exceeded expectations, so much so that the final displays occupied 3 rooms. And you can see here both a photograph of the original display and an image in the news coverage of the occasion of the inauguration. The finds were officially inaugurated by President Sadi Carnot in June 1888 in a ceremony attended by the Dieulafoy couple and respected intellectuals, including Ernest Renan. And this was widely covered in the press, in great part because it was also the occasion that Jane Dieulafoy was awarded the Legion of Honor. To work as an archaeologist and to be celebrated for doing so was exceptional for a 19th century woman, let alone someone who openly defied gender norms by cross-dressing and never having children. Jane Dieulafoy was able to work in the field because they had the support of her husband, and this work was recognized because it served nationalist aims. For France, acquiring Europe's most impressive collection of Persian antiquities constituted a show of imperial power and cultural capital intended to rival the British Museum. And in fact, a lot of the press coverage kept saying, French people have succeeded where an Englishman failed. And so this nationalist narrative was the reason why the mission benefited from an impressive level of cross-governmental support. In my archival research, I was really able to see how it wasn't just the Ministry of Fine Arts, which is responsible for the Louvre, but also the Ministry of International Affairs, of War, of Public Buildings. It really was several different ministries, plus the Prime Minister, who were involved in supporting this mission. Imperial power and cultural capital were not merely aspirations for the French nation. These were the very means by which the mission exploited the terms of the Firman agreement, granting France permission to carry out archaeological research on Iranian territory. The agreement stipulated that any precious metals and stones uncovered would belong to Iran, and that all other finds were to be split 50-50 between the French and Iranian government. Instead, the Dieulafoys took everything. The mission was able to transport the entirety of the finds by requisitioning a warship from the French Navy, and the Dieulafoys ensured that Nasruddin Shah would not be alerted to what was taking place at Susa by bribing both the governor of Khuzestan, then known as Arabistan, and the Shah's eldest son, with the promise of a Legion of Honor in exchange for their silence. Dieulafoy's published dig diary makes no secret of the bribery and deception that were deployed to appropriate the entirety of the finds for France. But Jane's is only one side of the story, at times exaggerated for effect. Today, drawing on my recent archival research, supported by the Leverhulme Trust, I will be complementing Jane's published account with private correspondence between members of the mission, the Louvre, and both official and unofficial diplomatic channels between the French and Iranian government. My fil rouge throughout this talk will be the Legion of Honor. I will consider first the function of a Legion of Honor in the international context of Franco-Qajar diplomacy, and then turn to its domestic use as good optics for the French government. And here, this photograph I'm using to illustrate is a photograph of one of the first archaeological finds of the frieze depicting lions, both found and photographed by Jane. I will read quotations in French, but I will always be providing English translations on the slides. And these quotations are all from private letters and documents kept in the French National Archives. À mon avis, le gouvernement français doit prendre de très haut la communication du ministre des Affaires étrangères de Téhéran et refuser avec raideur, au moins pour le moment, toutes les demandes de décoration. La seule carte qui reste dans notre jeu est l'envie qu'ont tous les Persans de recevoir le cordon français. Il faut la jouer avec prudence. What strikes me in this letter by Jane's husband, Marcel, to the director of the Louvre, Louis de Ronchou, is its clear-sighted account of the soft power that France exerts over Iran. What we have here is an example of a power asymmetry that Jalal Ahmad would later call Qarzadegi. Qajar officials valued a mere symbol of French distinction more highly than their own nation's material heritage. In the eyes of a Shah's eldest son, Mirza Massoud Zele Sultan, it was worth sacrificing the entirety of the SOAS artifacts in exchange for the red ribbon of the Grande Croix de la Légion d'honneur. This letter was written in between the first and second campaign of the archaeological mission, when the Dieulafoys were spending the hot summer months in France. It was unclear at the time whether the Qajar government would allow the Dieulafoys to return to Susa to complete the mission. And this was due to the mission occasioning protests from the clergy due to the proximity of the archaeological site to the tomb of Daniel, Abre Daniel. So here you have to the left of a slide a map drawn by Marcel Dieulafoy of the archaeological sites. The red lines show you the trenches where they were digging. And if you follow my arrow to the left, you see just how close the tomb of Daniel, this sacred site, was to the archaeological mission. While it would require diplomatic pressure for the archaeological site to be reopened, in Marcel's view, it was too soon to play the Legion of Honor card. The decoration should be withheld until the final and most crucial phase of the mission, namely the extraction of the finds from Iran. Alongside the official diplomatic channels of the French and Qajar foreign ministries, the Dieulafoys had access to an unofficial channel, one that was intimate and thus more effective. During their first journey to Iran back in 1881, the Dieulafoys had befriended Nasreddin Shah's personal physician, Dr. Tolosan. The three of them met when Marcel fell gravely ill, and Jane rushed him to Tehran to seek medical attention, which Tolosan offered, being a fellow Frenchman. And so ever since then, the three of them had remained friends and remained in touch. Tolosan had private access both to Nasreddin Shah and to Zele Sultan for their medical examinations. And so he used these opportunities to press the prince to protect the French mission. And here you have both a portrait of Tolosan, but included a telegraph to really show how closely involved Tolosan was. This was a matter both of getting permission for the mission to take place in the first place, but also during the two campaigns. Tolosan's telegrams would be this channel through which Ronchou, the director of the Louvre, would know immediately what was actually going on within the close circles of the monarchy. And so it allowed them to bypass the foreign ministries. So Tolosan repeatedly assured Ronchot that the mission had full support of Zélé Sultan, and so in his view, there was no reason to delay the award of a Legion of Honor to the prince. But Marcel cautioned the director of the Louvre that this might be an overly positive picture. And part of Marcel's reason for believing that Tolosan was painting a positive picture was that Tolosan himself was awarded the Legion of Honor in February 1885. This Legion of Honor was Tolosan's reward for being such an effective intermediary between France and Iran in the early stages of setting up the mission. It is likely that the Dieulafoys, who had been on the ground and knew the challenges that lay ahead for the mission, believed that the doctor had been decorated prematurely and that the same mistake should not be made with the prince. Ronchot followed Marcel's advice, and Zélé Sultan was only awarded the Legion of Honor in September 1886, after the artifacts had reached the Louvre. In order to keep the prince on side until then, Tolosan suggested in their private correspondence that the French government should try and secure some positive press coverage for the prince. So just as with the prince's desire for the Legion of Honor, we can see in this request for French press coverage that Zélé Sultan really gave great weight to how he was perceived by the French public. More weight, one might argue, than how he was perceived by Iranians. In September 1886, following on from the French government's delivery of Zélé Sultan's reward, Marcel Dieulafoy sent Ronchot a note to be forwarded to Charles de Freycinet. Freycinet at that time was both Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister. I'm confident that the undated manuscript that I'm about to share with you, which is written in Marcel Dieulafoy's hand and preserved in the same box of archival materials as Ronchot and Marcel's correspondence, is the note in question. And whether intended to be communicated orally by a French minister or representative in Iran or in writing, what is clear is that the statement is for the attention of Zélé Sultan and the Qajar monarchy more broadly, since it explains in the most flattering terms how the prince earned this illustrious decoration. As you'll see from the extracts I'm about to share, the document is a masterpiece of manipulation and historical revisionism. And I'm again going to read in French with a translation on the slide. Son Altesse impériale, Zélé Sultan, l'ombre du roi, fils du Shah et gouverneur général du sud de la Perse, vient d'être promu au grade de Grande Croix de la Légion d'honneur. Cette haute distinction avait déjà été accordée à son frère, le Valiat, héritier présomptif de la couronne. Il était donc très délicat et même très difficile d'élever un prince que les lois Qajar n'appellent pas au trône, à la même dignité que le futur roi de Perse. Aussi bien, n'est-ce pas par droit de naissance que Zélé Sultan a obtenu le grand cordon, mais par un droit bien plus enviable, le droit de conquête. Ce prince que la haute intelligence et ses remarquables capacités administratives ont fait depuis de longues années le premier personnage du royaume après le Shah. So you can really see the stage one, and this continues throughout the statement of the operation to rewrite history is flattery. Flattery towards Zélé Sultan for being so open-minded and helpful, and therefore much more deserving of a Legion of Honor than his other family members. And this is where the breach of the agreement is admitted to. Au terme du firmament accordé à l'administration des beaux-arts, deux lots égaux devaient être faits du produit des fouilles. L'un restait à la France, l'autre devenait la propriété du Shah. Cette part était inutile aux Persans, car malgré leur vive intelligence et leur culture littéraire très supérieure à celle des autres musulmans, ils n'étaient pas encore en état de tirer parti de semblables trésors. Le prince a compris cette situation. Zélé Sultan donna des ordres pour que tous les objets découverts, sans exception, fussent remis à M. Dieulafoy et autorisa le chef de notre mission à faire sortir les collections du territoire persan. C'est cette conduite éminemment généreuse qui dénote une âme ouverte à tous les grands sentiments. C'est ce cadeau royal que le gouvernement français a voulu reconnaître. So, there are quite a few things going on here, which is why I call this a masterpiece of manipulation. First of all, the blame for the agreement being broken and the entirety of the fines being taken to France is placed solely with Zélé Sultan. It was his decision, and I've, abbreviated the statement, but it repeats several times that it was Zélé Sultan who said all the finds should be taken to France, rather than this being the Dieulafoy's plan and goal all along. We also have this continued flattering, both of the prince, but of the Persians more broadly. And we have here a classic trope, which I've encountered a lot of times through writing my previous book, Iran and French Orientalism, whereby one elevates the Persians by denigrating over Muslims, right? So the Persians, they have the most beautiful literature and the great intelligence, and that's what makes them better to their neighbors, to other Muslim nations. And this was a classic trick of flattery. And it's interesting to think how perhaps we still have this logic ongoing and this internalization of what makes Iranians superior to their neighbors. And here, of course, the flattery is all part of a strategy to appropriate the SOAS artifacts. Note also this phrase, the royal gift, ce don royal. And this is the extra layer of genius at play here, evil genius, if you like. What we're saying is the Qajars are generous, the Qajars are wonderful, they gave us the artifacts. So suddenly the act of robbery becomes an act of praise, a piece of evidence of how superior the Qajars are, and therefore, were the Qajars to turn around and say, wait a minute, this isn't true, you sneaked off with everything, this would mean that they are not generous, that they are not enlightened. And for Zélé Sultan specifically, since we are told that he was given the Legion of Honor because he was so supportive of the French mission, this would mean then that he no longer deserves the Legion of Honor. So as well as rewriting what happened, the statement is buying Qajar approval and acquiescence for the finds to remain in Paris. And it's a move for the Qajars to save face by going along with this complete piece of fiction that the finds were a gift. And clearly, by all accounts, they were not a gift. I can't stress how much this is really rewriting history and not a truthful account by any means. So, for all these reasons, and to by his silence and continued support, Zélé Sultan is awarded the Legion of Honor. But he was to be the last Persian to be awarded the Legion of Honor for his support for the mission. Or we might also call it unwitting support. So after Zélé Sultan was awarded the Legion of Honor, Marcel Dieulafoy started lobbying for 3 more individuals to be rewarded. And these were, I quote here a letter by Marcel, 1st of February 1887, Muzaffar al-Mulk, the governor of Arabistan during the time of the search, his advisor, Mustafa Khan, and a local leader, Sheikh Mazel Khan, who helped the Dieulafoys essentially survive and transport the finds out of Susa. Marcel made this request several times. He wrote again and again, repeating that the mission would not have been possible without the support of these 3 individuals. His requests were denied repeatedly. And I think this example makes it really clear that the French government was not actually interested in rewarding those Iranians who provided material help, but simply in buying the consent of a Qajar monarchy. Only French individuals were to be rewarded for taking part in the mission. And so here I've made a helpful table of the awardees and rejects, as we just saw. The governor of Khuzestan, his advisor, and the local leader were not awarded the Legion of Honor. Dr. Tolozan is awarded the Legion of Honor very early when the search has barely started. Zélé Sultan is awarded the Legion of Honor when the finds arrive in Paris. And Jane Dieulafoy finally is awarded the Legion of Honor when the rooms are properly inaugurated and available to be visited by the French public. So this brings me to the second part of my talk, good optics. When one reads through the archives of the SOAS mission with an eye for Jane Dieulafoy, two things clearly emerge. First of all, Jeanne's active and substantial role in the mission, as made clear by Marcel's written accounts of the division of labor. And secondly, the French government's silence with regards to Jeanne's participation. Jeanne is not named in any piece of intergovernmental correspondence. I venture that this silence is caused by the government's discomfort at having a woman play a key role in one of France's most significant, expensive, and dangerous archaeological missions, easier to act as though Jeanne was never there. As such, there is a disjunct between Jeanne's erasure in state documents written between 1885 and 1887 and Jeanne's public recognition with the award of the Legion of Honor in 1888. And so I will now explore why and how Jane Dieulafoy came to be decorated. So on this slide, I wanted to sort of give you a bare bones picture of how the mission worked. A very clear hierarchy with Marcel Dieulafoy, Jeanne's husband, being the person officially in charge of the mission. It was his first time directing an archaeological mission, but he had a lot of experience directing French infrastructure projects as a civil engineer. So he was clearly awarded the mission in terms of his project management skills, but also his personal passion for Iranian architecture and art. He and Jeanne had traveled 2 years around Iran researching Iranian architecture on their own funds before the mission taking place. Jeanne was Marcel's second in command, with objectively the most responsibilities on site, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. Then in the top picture, you see there are two other Frenchmen with them, and these were effectively their graduate assistants. So one had recently graduated from the École Normale and the other from the École des Ponts et Chaussées, and they were assigned by the government to help Jeanne and Marcel Dieulafoy. And then, of course, the reality of a backbreaking work of digging. The mission hired hundreds of Iranian workers on sites. The majority of these adults, but there are also some children working on site, and it's quite obvious on some of the pictures you can see some figures are smaller and younger. And there was a hierarchy with certain workers being in charge of managing and observing, and others just in charge of digging. And of course, they would have been paid a fraction of what French workers would be paid for similar work. So that's the characters that were living in Susa and working in Susa during the 2 years of the campaign taking place. Marcel writes to Ronchot as follows, at the time of one of the first finds, which was a frieze depicting a lion. C'est ma femme, pour le moment, qui a gagné le plus gros lot. Je lui avais confié le tumulus achéménide parce qu'elle connaissait très bien toutes les questions se rattachant à l'architecture persépolitaine. Elle a trié elle-même et une à une les briques émaillées, et grâce aux soins et à la méthode qu'elle a mis dans la direction du travail, m'a permis de reconstruire toute la frise émaillée. So here we are told that Jeanne is put in charge of one of the most promising tumuli because of knowledge of Persian architecture. So this is the first point. Marcel knows that Jeanne will be more familiar with ancient Persian art than Babin and Mousset, and so can be trusted with identifying artifacts. But then we're told about the care and the attention to detail. She personally sorted one by one the glazed bricks, and thanks to the care and method that she put into the direction of the works, I was able to reconstruct the entire frieze. So Jeanne is there in terms of someone who knows the art, but also who can take charge of the diggers. In Jeanne's diary, we're told it was 50 workers digging that particular section and then reconstituting the artifacts that are found. Later on, Marcel would write a final account on the occasion of the inauguration of the finds and Jeanne being awarded the Legion of Honor, giving even more detail in terms of what Jeanne did on site during the period of the mission. And we can see it's quite a hefty to-do list. À Madame Dieulafoy fut attribuée la rédaction du journal, l'enregistrement des objets trouvés, la surveillance des chantiers où des découvertes avaient été opérées et l'emballage. La surveillance des chantiers constituait un travail d'autant plus pénible et délicat qu'il fallait surveiller l'extraction de chaque brique, en relever exactement la position absolue et en relative, la dessiner sur place, lui donner un numéro d'ordre, assister au transport et à l'arrivée dans les magasins. De l'exact terme des notes devait dépendre le succès du montage et de la restitution. Ce travail s'est réparti sur plus de 4000 briques répandues sur 300 mètres de tranchées, dont la profondeur variait de 5 à 9 mètres. L'emballage des 50 000 kilos d'objets rapportés par la mission ne constituait pas un travail moins assujettissant, d'autant qu'il était forcément confié à des ouvriers inhabiles qu'il fallait non pas guider, mais aider. These accounts make it clear that Jeanne's contribution to the mission was substantial and pivotal to its success, both as someone keeping the written and photographic record, but also cataloguing every single found item and making sure it was safely packed, but also clearly identified so that one could, upon arrival in Paris, reassemble the 4,000 bricks into the various friezes and artworks which they formed. The work and life in the archaeological camp was physically grueling. The French team suffered from heat stroke, hunger, and dysentery, and obviously we know nothing of the workers, but we assumed, given the physical effort and the heat, they too were suffering from hunger and ill health. But despite this, when we read Jeanne's private letters to Ronchot, the Louvre director, and also Jeanne's published diary, the tone is never one of suffering. It is a tone of joy in the work, tempered only by the fear of failure. So the first passage is from one of Jeanne's letters to Ronchot. La veille du jour de Noël, les ouvriers mettaient à découvert d'énormes briques. Quelle bonne journée je me suis offerte! On ne peut se faire une idée de la splendide couleur de ces émaux quand ils revoient le jour après tant de siècles d'ensevelissement. So here we have this really strong, quelle bonne journée je me suis offerte, the idea of hard work and cataloguing and going through all the finds. That is happiness, according to Jeanne. That is enjoyment, much more than a comfortable life in Paris. In Dieulafoy's dig diary, we read both of this joy, but also of the fear of not being able to share the finds, i.e. not being able to bring them to France. Mon enthousiasme pour mes 12 fils, les immortels, n'a d'égal que la crainte de ne pouvoir montrer à la France cette merveille artistique. And then in the later passage, when Dieulafoy is bedridden due to having dysentery, we read « J'enrage, je ne puis mettre un pied devant l'autre, et l'on vient de découvrir un nouveau lion dans le prolongement de la première tranchée. » So you always have a sense of Jeanne almost sulking in frustration of having to stay in the tent and rest and hopefully not die instead of being out examining the finds and assisting in the dig. So we have a sense here both of Jeanne's enjoyment of the work, but also of Jeanne's profound investment in the success of the mission. And it's clear that Jeanne very much identifies with this work. In the middle quote there, we have the frieze depicting archers, which the Dieulafoys identified as the immortals, the royal guard, as referred to by Herodotus, as sons, as children. So there's this idea of being a mother in the literal sense and giving birth. The labor of giving birth has been replaced by the labor of archaeology and research. And that's what gives Jeanne satisfaction. But at the same time, it will somehow all be in vain if the finds are not brought to the Louvre. And we have the same sense of a high stakes and of duty to the French nation in the opening of a dig diary. Autant j'avais affronté avec calme les hasards d'une première expédition perse, alors que nous engagions santé et fortune personnelle, autant j'étais inquiète. Je ne craignais ni les fatigues, ni les dangers, mais je tremblais à la pensée d'un échec. So we have someone so committed to bringing the artifacts to France that they are willing to very much risk their life, their health, all they have, always in the name of the nation. But of course, for Jane Dieulafoy, it's always double-edged. There's on the one hand, the very personal, private narrative of joy in the work, but also this desire for public recognition, this desire to earn their name as the great loyal servant of the French nation. So you have both that private narrative and the public narrative constantly intertwined. And yet the French government seems to have been reticent to recognize this loyal servant. As we saw, whereas Tolosan who had never set foot in Susa and taken no part in the practicalities of the archaeological mission. He was decorated in February 1885. Jeanne was not decorated until June 1888. And this was despite persistent lobbying from Marcel Dieulafoy and Louis de Ronchot, starting from late 1885. Should be my last two passages that I'll quote. So the first is Marcel lobbying Ronchot, the director of the Louvre, to intervene with the French government so that Jeanne is awarded the Legion of Honor. Je suis absolument désireux de voir reporter sur ma femme les récompenses que je crois être en droit d'obtenir, et cela non seulement pour un sentiment d'affection bien naturel, mais aussi par simple équité. Car j'ai trouvé dans ma femme non pas seulement une compagne dévouée et courageuse, mais le collaborateur le plus utile et le plus intimement mêlé à mes travaux et à mes découvertes. What strikes me in Marcel's letter, as well as its highly moral tone, which of course ignores the exploitation of Iran, right? When quite a lot of irony whenever we're talking about equity and fairness, knowing how the finds were taken out of Iran illegally, but focusing on the Dieulafoy couple here, Marcel takes this moral tone of fairness, equity, but also what's interesting how he makes his case is the gendering of a language. And because this is lost in English here, I've highlighted in yellow in both French and English the passages I'm referring to. So Marcel starts out by referring to his wife as une compagne dévouée et courageuse, so feminine, and then he starts writing mais la, so it looks like he's about to keep writing in the feminine, mais la collaboratrice, but in the letter he strikes out the la, correcting himself, and changes the la to le. So we switch to the masculine. Le collaborateur le plus utile et le plus intimement mêlé à mes travaux. So we get a sense in this letter of Marcel trying to capture on the one hand the wife, the personal relationship, but also the professional partner. And it seems that for Jeanne to be a true professional, they have to be referred in male terms, le collaborateur. And there's several ways we could see this. Perhaps on the one hand, this is simply a strategy on Marcel's behalf to present Jeanne as a serious professional, because of course women were not serious professionals. Women did not have careers in research and archaeology. Therefore, switching to the masculine makes Jeanne sound more serious, more worthy of respect. But I also think this hesitance between the masculine and the feminine also reflects Jeanne's own self-presentation, which was quite ambiguous and didn't neatly fall into the 19th century gender binary. Madame Dieulafoy was clearly not a man, it was Madame. But at the same time, Jeanne did not look and did not act like a 19th century French woman. I've included here a posed photograph of Marcel and Jeanne in their husband, which was part of a special magazine feature on Jane Dieulafoy. And I would really like to highlight not just the fact that Jeanne is dressed as a man and has cropped hair, but the fact that Jeanne is standing, commanding the photograph. And it's Marcel, who the man, the older individual, who's almost looking up to Jeanne as the source of authority and knowledge. And this is just one example of how Jeanne really did not fit the mold of what it meant to be a woman in the French 19th century. And in the eyes of Ronchot, the director of the Louvre, who submitted the formal request for Jeanne's decoration on 16 December 1885, no, again, 1885, it took 3 years for the award to come. For Ronchot, gender was indeed the main obstacle to Jeanne's decoration. Having listed in his letter Jeanne's important contributions to the success of the mission, as well as Jeanne's reputation as un écrivain distingué, a distinguished writer, he comes to the crux of the matter, why the French government might consider decorating a woman. And you have to the left of the actual photograph of the original letter. L'intrépide voyageuse qui a contribué à des services éminents rendus à la science ne peut-elle être approchée en cette occasion de la grande artiste qui a trouvé dans la culture de l'art la gloire et la fortune? Le public a approuvé la décoration donnée par l'Empire à Rosa Bonheur. Il applaudirait, je n'en doute pas, à une distinction pareille que le gouvernement de la République accorderait à Madame Dieulafoy. So he's basically arguing for a precedent here. Before Jeanne, there had been only 2 women to receive the Legion of Honor. One was a woman who fought in the French Revolution. And then the second, quite some time after, was the painter Rosa Bonheur. Hence, we know she's a woman, therefore she shouldn't get the Legion of Honor, because women shouldn't really, but there has been a woman recently, and it went down well with the public. That's key, right? The public approved of Rosa Bonheur's decoration. Might they not applaud Jeanne's? So we have precedent, but also good PR as the 2 arguments put forward. Yet, despite all these excellent points, the requests were at first ignored, leading me to ask, so what was it that made the French government change its mind in 1888 when it finally awarded Jeanne the Legion of Honor? And I'm going to suggest there are 2 reasons for this. So the first is that by then, the Louvre collection has been inaugurated. The success of the mission is an incontrovertible fact. We were meant to have 1 room full of artifacts. Now we have 3 rooms. It's vast, it's impressive. Everybody can come to the Louvre, admire France. In fact, in the archives, I found also letters from British museum directors coming to Paris to admire the finds. So it's just that the international significance of the finds and their breadth has been established. So I'd say that's one important factor. But the second key factor, I will argue, is what we might today call Jeanne's star power. As a talented writer and photographer, Jeanne had been building their public image as a great adventurer and expert on Iranian culture from as early as 1883, so 5 years before the award. The travelogue of their first journey to Iran, which took place 1881 to 1882, was published in installments in the periodical Le Tour du Monde between 1883 and 1884, and as a book by Hachette in 1887. And here we have this text-image relationship because we have both Jeanne's excellent, very witty writing, but also the photographs that illustrate Jeanne's writing. And both those things together really seized the imagination of the French public. And then over 1887 and 1888, Jeanne did the same thing with the Dig Diary of the SOAS mission. The diary was published in installments in Le Tour du Monde, and then in 1888 as a book with Hachette. So Jeanne may have been a minor character in the eyes of the French government, but they were the protagonist of their publications, and by 1888 had become a beloved public figure. The publication of the Dig Diary meant that French readers could learn directly from Jeanne the nature of her contribution to the SOAS mission. In literary terms, the first-person narration and feeling of intimacy created by the diary form encouraged readers to identify with the author. This meant that content and form worked together to make readers invested in Jeanne's success and in turn desirous to see it recognized. Whereas Marcel and Ronchot had been lobbying the French government, Jeanne had communicated directly with the French people and won their hearts. Ronchot was thus right to forecast a positive public reaction to the decoration. To deny Jeanne the Legion of Honor would have been quite literally bad press. The Belgian writer Georges Rodenbach noted that the public's infatuation, and the word he uses engouement, so the public's infatuation with Jeanne was so strong that Marcel was almost forgotten. He was just sort of put behind in the shadow of his star wife. So to conclude, the successes that earned Jeanne the Legion of Honor were premised on the exploitation of Iran. The Dieulafoy couple had no qualms about breaking their firman because they perceived Iran to be France's cultural and political inferior. Tragically, so did Zélé Sultan when he turned a blind eye to what was happening in Susa in the hope of being awarded the Red Sash. My research shows that the Legion of Honor was deliberately instrumentalized by French officials, first to extract the finds from Iran, and then to shift the blame for this onto Zélé Sultan. The decoration was equally employed to reward Dr. Tolleson for lobbying the Shah and the Prince in the intimate setting of medical examinations. In the end, however, it is Jeanne who had the last laugh when the French government, so effective at forcing the hand of the Qajars, had its own hand forced by the tides of public opinion and could no longer avoid making Jane Dieulafoy Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I say, I really loved all of the slides with the images and all of those detailed quotes. So we had a couple of early questions. I mean, one is really the earliest question is relating to the fall of Zelle Sultan. Um, Someone mentions, it's not really a question, but just mentions that they remember reading about that in the book by E.G. Brown, A Year Amongst the Persians. So I wonder if E.G. Brown also mentioned the Dieulafoys. I don't know if you've
I
come
don't know,
across that
but
in
I'll
that
look it
text.
up. I'm not as familiar
Yeah, no.
with the
The question, however, is was the prince's fall related to his letting the French to steal this treasure? Like, is
I'm
that why?
genuinely not sure because I'm an expert more of French history than I
Yeah.
am history.
So,
So I'm not familiar at one point the fall of Zele Sultan came, but I wouldn't be surprised because it's really a huge blunder. And it's just such a sign of weakness to be so easily manipulated through this promise of a
yeah,
reward. So I don't have the evidence to answer yes, but my instinct is that that's very likely.
it might have been a factor. Yep. Okay. And then we've got another listener, observer, thanking you for your presentation. And so apparently they say in the memoirs of Jeanne Dieulafoy, she recounts an incident where she attempted to damage a column capital at Persepolis due to difficulties in transporting it to France. Have you encountered any other instances where she seems to comment on engaging in acts of vandalism or
So
damage?
this is not a Persepolis. This is actually, if you put back the image that was the cover of my talk, that's the bull capital that's now in the Louvre. So yes, that is recorded in the diary. So Susa was getting frustrated about not being able to lift it, to find a technological way to lift it, to transport it, and then in frustration throws a hammer at it, and it breaks, and then this act of vandalism then becomes seen as the solution because then it's a way to transport the pieces to France and glue them together. So that is actually the pillar that is now in the Louvre. It's the only occasion of violence I've come across in any of the writings. It's really quite shocking out of character because otherwise we really have this absolute fascination with Iranian art and this determination to preserve it and transport it in its integrity to France. So there aren't any other accounts where you have this kind of violence.
I mean, I had a question myself thinking about I was in the Louvre in that room where we see those bulls just in the summer this last year. So when we go to the Louvre today, how much of the things that we're looking at are from this collection that was brought back by the Dieulafoy?
A substantial parts of the bull's head. There's now several friezes of arches, but what would have been the first sort of tallest frieze of arches with floral decorations framing it. The staircase, banister, and the lions. These were all found by the Dieulafoy mission with the direct involvement of Jeanne Dieulafoy. And later, Jacques de Morgan takes over as the main director of French archaeological research at SOAS. And de Morgan found more friezes of arches. And so that's why in the Louvre you have several friezes of arches. But yeah, the most substantial finds are the ones from the original Dieulafoy mission.
Wow. And they must have been, I mean, as you mentioned with that, the vandalism that ended up happening, they just were very heavy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're
So were
talking
they
about
transported by
tons.
boat?
They were through a ship from the Navy. So first we have several sort of convoys going from Susa to the Persian Gulf.
Mm.
And so this would have been with horse-drawn carts. And then at one point they are on, I think they're on Kelek, on these quite fragile boats down the river. And then the sort of big final stage is the loading of all of it on a French war vessel, essentially. So to me, this really exemplifies both the cross-governmental support and how, the politics of empire, right? The French had this important navy because it had colonies, and because it had this navy, they could transport the finds. And I actually found in the archives, all the correspondence around this. You have Monchot writing to the military saying, we need a ship. And then you have telegrams saying, we need ship in this location at this time. And, within 48 hours, basically, a ship has been dispatched and is on the way to
Wow.
collect the finds.
Great, thank you. So I've got a couple of questions from the audience. Someone asks, what if these excavations hadn't happened by the French? what's your thoughts on whether it would have been better to be left in the ground for Iranians themselves to identify by Iranian archaeologists at some other point in the future?
I think it's hard because I'm not an archaeologist. I would say, of course, today technology is far more advanced. So if we'd had that archaeological research in the 21st century rather than the 19th century, I'm sure it would have been done much more carefully and, with less damage to the
Mm,
site and the finds.
yeah.
But then I sort of analyze the history. I'm not really one for saying what should have
Yeah,
happened.
yeah.
Yeah.
Fair enough. And more thanks for such a wonderful presentation and for sharing your really interesting research. Do you have any information about the network of women friends of Jeanne de la Foy? Is there anything in the records about her relationships with
Mm.
Iranian women
Mhm.
or other women in Paris, in France?
Yeah, so Jeanne is quite funny because she doesn't really like women. We have a clear sense in the diaries and the writings that Jeanne's uh, friends tend to be men. Both in Iran, we have Dr. Tolozan, we have Father Pascal, who was an Armenian priest in Esfahan, and Jeanne was quite Catholic, so really connected with him in terms of faith. In France, Jeanne was friends with other writers and travelers such as Pierre Loti, and so didn't have as many, I would say, close women friends as male friends. In the travelogues, we do have accounts of meeting Iranian women. And I think that's quite particular to Jeanne because Jeanne spoke Farsi. She'd actually bothered to learn Persian, which others wouldn't have at the time necessarily. And so that's quite interesting to see these dialogues being recorded between Jeanne and Hajar women.
Thank you very much. There's a final comment in the Q&A at the moment. It's not exactly a question, but just commenting on Susa was built as it was a castle as a base built with ancient bricks. Um, I'm not quite sure how to phrase that into a question. So, but I guess it's just giving that the audience member is giving that information about the ancient context, I guess, of in which these finds were being made. If anyone else has anything else that they would like to ask, I'll invite you to do so now. Otherwise, if there's anything, I feel like uh, um, what's his name? The former presenter of In Our Time. And then they always say, is there anything that you talked about now you're wishing you had mentioned something, anything that you missed? So I guess if we've got a few minutes, I can say to Julia, if there's anything that you suddenly are thinking in reflection on some of those questions that you didn't put into the presentation, any final thing that you would like any of the audience members to know? I
Mm.
suppose you probably put everything
I
into your
fit it in,
talk.
yeah, or I
Yeah.
could, I
But while we've got a
suppose,
few minutes
yeah,
available, if there's anything that's popping into
yeah.
your mind, then obviously here's a chance.
I suppose that question of obviously that act of appropriation by France of Iranian antiquities. I think what interests me is this wider question of Qajars such as El Sultan not valuing the archaeological heritage so much. Even if you look at the Firman, the terms, right, what's interested is precious metal, right? Nasruddin Shah put in, if you find precious metals, precious gems, they belong to Iran. And then the rest we share 50-50. So even within the actual terms of the archaeological agreement, it's like the ancient artifacts are secondary
Mm,
to the prospect of fine metals. So I think there's something at place here, and I think it is to do with fetishizing Europe, wanting to be more European, but there's this wider political
yes.
context of Qajar not putting enough stock or value on this ancient Iranian heritage, and then that giving the French a window of opportunity to appropriate it.
Yeah.
I think that's what I find both sad but really interesting about this chapter of history.
Yeah, absolutely. And while you've been talking, we've got a couple more questions have
Mm.
popped up. So someone's asking whether do you think possibly that the delay in recognition, I'm thinking that's the recognition of having
Mm.
the Legion of Honor, have anything to do with the knowledge of the illegality of the shipment to France?
So to the French, no.
I'm guessing not because
Yeah,
the men got
yeah,
their recognition.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And the French were really happy that they got all the fines and were really proud of it. And also, what Marcel wrote in that statement, flattering Zélé Sultan, that sort of then became also the official narrative in France. So it was
Mm,
actually believed that the Qajar
yes.
had granted permission for this to take place. So I think it would have been only more the inner circles who would have known what really happened. And
Mm,
but Jeanne's fans, Jeanne's readers, because in the published diary, it is acknowledged there. But then they already have that buy-in of thinking Jeanne's an absolute hero. And so they're not
yes.
going to criticize any of that.
Mm. A couple of people are asking about whether this is being recorded. It is being recorded, and it will be up on the BIPS YouTube channel, at some point soon, hopefully, once it's all prepared for that. And then another question. Again, thanks for the presentation. Behind many of the archaeological and historical research on ancient Persia and indeed the ancient Near East in general, there's a mix of imperial and nationalist interests colliding with a scholarly interest in biblical study, in the historical dimensions regarding biblical scriptures and theology. And so the questioner is asking whether you found any indications of theological questions
Mm.
relating to this excavation and the motivation to conduct this excavation.
Actually, that question already made me think of one thing that I wished I'd said sooner, which is actually there could be clashes, as this question very well formulates, between the nationalist aims and the scholarly aims. And so I've not quoted it in this presentation, but there's actually a passage in the diary where Jeanne actually says the French government just wants as many objects as possible for the Louvre, whereas we want to understand an ancient civilization. And so there the conflict is apparent that the Dieulafoy couple know that the real goal for the government
Mm,
is knowledge. It's that imperial competition, that showmanship, that rivalry with the British Museum. And so
mm,
they're frustrated that it should really be about understanding ancient civilizations. In terms of biblical interest, yes, that's very in Dieulafoy because Dieulafoy was quite Christian. And so there are these moments of, calling upon passages from the Bible, but also ancient
mm.
Greek literature and these sort of elegiac passages. It's like, oh, all that has vanished, this great empire that was once there. It's often tainted by these cultural layers of the Bible as well as the classics.
Absolutely fascinating. Thanks everybody for all your really interesting questions so that we could, learn a bit more and hear a bit more from Julia. And Julia, thank you so much. And we especially appreciate talking for so long when I know you had a little bit of a sore throat there. So that was great. You got through it. And thank you very much, everyone. And we hope to see you again in February for our next webinar. Thank you very much. Have a good evening,
Thank
everybody.
you, everyone. Thank you for listening. Bye.
Thanks.